What's going on, family? It is your boy Joe hitting you with a special installment to the Legacy Disciple live stream. I'm so glad to be in front of y'all. Man, I'm assuming that many of y'all are probably Houston locals. And yeah, as I said earlier, Houston has been my favorite city to have lived in. So much has been a root for me, has been a foundation for me in Houston as far as an artist, but more specifically as a believer. Learned a lot of things, learned God in a new way in that space and in that time that I had in in Houston. And so very thankful for Houston. I wish I could be there right now. Like I was looking forward to this day in Houston to be back in that city and also to perform and speak and do this poetry slam and all that stuff like that. But God had other plans for us, but he still had it in his plans that we would be together, even if it's virtually, even if I can't see your faces right now. He has us together for such a time as this. And I'm so thankful to be in front of you. I'm also thankful, particularly for people who are eager to still be here and learn from God's word and to hear what he has to say, considering where we're at right now. I believe I've been sort of hinting at this. I did a live stream earlier last week, or actually earlier this week, and did a video on my YouTube channel as well that sort of lends itself to this space, even when we're talking about in James, about what we should be doing in a time like this. It is so apropos, so timely that this year's legacy just so happened to be about being devoted to prayer. And if you weren't devoted to prayer before now, now is the time, fam. If you didn't have any other motivation than a global pandemic to get your behind on the ground, on the edge of your bed and pray, now is the time. God is always using things like this to draw us to himself even more. And so today we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about praying in faith. And I'll try to do this as a sermon, but I also kind of want to feel sort of Bible study-ish as well, since, we're getting to sit down, and I want to feel a little less formal per se, sort of feel like a normal live stream, man. So we're going to be talking about praying in faith. And this afternoon, I will be coming from the book of James, chapter 1, verse 2 through 8. And I'll go ahead and read the first verse as well, just so that we can sort of not just hop into, there's only one extra verse. So we'll start at verse 1 of James chapter 1. I read from the CSB version. Your version probably doesn't read too much different than mine. So it's James chapter 1, verse 1. We're going to read to verse 8. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad. Greetings. We are dispersed abroad right now. So this is so timely. To the legacy disciples dispersed abroad. Greetings. Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let your endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Now, if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without doubting. For the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded and unstable in all his ways. I decided to preach from this passage. One, we're talking about faith. We're talking about trials and tribulations. And I think that's obviously a thing that's on the minds and hearts of many people right now. And also something, this passage, I was given quite a few options. I forget how many options, but there was quite a few options that Legacy wanted to choose from in passages. And I wanted to choose anyone but this one. I've seen this passage before, and many of you have probably heard me speak about doubt before. And I've never really known what to do with this verse. I won't say never known, but I felt some kind of way about it because I felt like it was an attack on me. And so I just decided not to deal with it. And even particularly for choosing this passage, I felt the same way again, like, man, I really want to sort of avoid this thing. And so I did the opposite. When I moved to Chicago, I asked my pastor, before I moved to Chicago, I asked my pastor some wisdom on whether or not I should stay in Houston or I should move to Chicago. And I was really scared to move to Chicago. And not just for, the typical stereotypical reasons, but just like a lack of certainty, never living outside of that space before in Texas. And so I didn't know what to do. And he said, you're not going to make a wrong or sinful decision in either way, whether you go to Chicago or you stay in Houston. But he told me, whatever you do, choose the option that makes you trust Jesus more. Whatever you do, choose the option that makes you trust Jesus more. And so that's been a really great piece of wisdom for me in my life in general. And I use that same piece of wisdom even now in choosing the passage that I would come from, James chapter 1. Which passage will I choose to preach from? I think this is the one that's going to cause me to trust Jesus more. So I decided to do this one. And right now, the obvious, I won't continue to state the obvious, but I can't preach this afternoon without some way recognizing the elephant in the millions of rooms across the country, which is the fact that we are all on some type of quarantine or stay at home order. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know where this thing will lead us. Many of us were planning out our weeks and months to come, and that's just not the case anymore. You can only plan day by day right now. We are in a trial and a very obvious tribulation. You cannot plan out the rest of your year. And what this has been causing is a lot of disturbance and turbulence, and even I would say some tossing some people in the wind. This is a very surging sea for us, this trial that we're in right now. And so this is a perfect time for us to decide which one are we going to be. Are we going to be the people who trust God and pray in faith and are steadfast, or are we going to be double-minded and unstable? In this passage, it starts off in James chapter 1, verse 2. It says, consider it, or count it, as some of your versions may say. Count it a great joy. Count it all joy whenever you experience various trials, because you know, tell your neighbor, if you don't know, now you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect. So what is the full effect? Well, to be mature and complete and lacking nothing. What is it that we are trying to endure for? Well, I think the hint for us later on in James chapter 1, I believe it's in verse 12, if we read just ahead to sort of get an idea of what he was lending himself to and for endurance. He says, blessed is the one who endures trials, because he has stood the test of time. The test he will receive. He has stood the test. He will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. So we are wanting to endure to the end. This is not simply, our trials and tribulations are not simply that we would endure them for the time being. I'm not simply enduring this pandemic simply that we can make it just give me to the next 6 months so we can get back to life as usual. That's a very short-minded, very nearsighted version of what it means to endure. No, his idea is that every trial and every tribulation is trying to get us to a much bigger picture, which is the crown of life at the end of all of this. And so endure this. Even now, whatever trials you may go through is the testing of your faith that produces endurance. And he says, count it or consider it joy, weigh it out. The judgment that you should make about this situation is that this is going to bring about joy. But if our joy depends on circumstances, then this word from our brother James is only applicable in certain seasons of life. As a matter of fact, his words may even be pointless if they only apply to the good seasons of life. Consider it joy when you get more money in your account. Consider it joy when the globe is not under a pandemic or a quarantine. Consider it joy when things go the way you expected it. I don't need divine scriptures to tell me that. That's a natural response. If you give a fool $10,000, you don't have to tell him, consider it joy that I gave you $10,000. Like, no. He can discern very easily that $10,000 will make him happy. And so I promise I actually live in a very safe neighborhood. We got an ambulance. Oh, that's not the police, that's the ambulance. I'm not sure what's happening. Had flashbacks to living with Brian. And so if you give $10,000 to a fool, we don't need divine inspiration to tell us to consider that joy. It doesn't take wisdom to discern that, but a wise person can discern what the times are for. And these times are to be considered for joy. To consider it this way, that, yeah, joy is joy. Anyone can see that, and trials are trials, but to discern them as the same thing is wisdom. And if you don't see it this way, then you're lacking something. What are you lacking? You're lacking wisdom. If you don't see these times right now as joy, then what are you lacking? You're lacking wisdom. And that leads us to verse 5. Now, if anyone lacks wisdom, hey, that might be you. If you've been freaking out right now, like I have been in a couple of times, I'm not going to lie to y'all, then if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. He will give you wisdom. Knowledge is information. Wisdom is knowing what to do with said information. And this is why wisdom is so priceless, because it can adapt to many different situations, many different informations, okay? The information changes often, but God's wisdom endures forever. And so knowledge is information, but wisdom is knowing what to do with said information. And so the information for today is obvious, but wisdom is the ability to discern what to do with what information that we're seeing online or on TV, or even information that may have nothing to do with this pandemic. Life still goes on and problems are still going. I had a friend hit me up last night about a family member going through a heart attack, and that has nothing to do with the pandemic, had nothing to do with COVID-19. Trials continue over and over again, even when the bigger trials are going on. And so the bad news is this: all of us lacks wisdom in some way. That's bad news. No matter your any earthly attribute that you may have, whether it be wealth, ambitiousness, you got the go-getter mentality, to hustle, cleverness, intelligence, social status, political power, ethnicity, your position in the church, male, female, child, or adult, educated or uneducated. It doesn't matter. When it comes to godly wisdom, we all lack it in some way. Being finite, we lack it in some way. But here's the good news: God gives it out indiscriminately, without partiality, to any earthly, despite any earthly attribute we may have, whether it be wealth, ambitiousness, cleverness, intelligence, hustle, social status, political power, ethnicity, power in the church, or position in the church, male or female, whatever. It doesn't matter what your earthly attributes are. God gives it freely. But I'll make a point about that in just a moment. Let's get to verse 6, and then we'll get to some application here shortly. The next verse says this: but let him ask in faith. So are you lacking? Are you lacking? Well, let him ask in faith without doubting, for the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. This is a great moment for me. I had to remind, as much as I've been reading the word, as much as I challenge myself to read things in context and tell other people, well, you got to read the context or whatever. For the longest, I was stripping this thing out of context in my own brain. I've read through the book of James several times, and for some reason, because of my own inclination, my own insecurity about doubt, I thought this meant something other than it did. How quickly I turned this into material things. The next verse, he says that person should expect receive nothing from the Lord, being double-minded and unstable in all his ways. This has nothing to do with material things. This does not mean that God will not give you anything, or that God somehow will not answer any of your prayers. This is not a barring on people who have vacillated or doubted, but it is a warning and it is a truthful statement. Let me break this down what I mean. This can't be about material things, because the beginning of this passage is very easy. We've been talking about wisdom. He simply says, if you lack wisdom, ask for it. And then the contrast of it is, but if you ask for it, don't ask in doubt. And so asking for the wisdom is talking about wisdom. We should not turn this into material or earthly things, or God won't give me a spouse, or God won't give me this, or health, or whatever it may be. It's talking about wisdom. And we learn from the book of Proverbs over and over again that wisdom is the principal thing. Wisdom is better than the earthly gifts. Wisdom is better than silver, more precious than jewels. Proverbs 3 says, if you let wisdom be the adornment around your neck, when you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be pleasant. Proverbs 3 lets us know that if you make wisdom the adornment around your neck, when there's a COVID-19 pandemic outside, you will not be afraid. You will lie down and you will sleep pleasant in the pandemic. And every good and perfect thing comes from the Father of lights. God gives to the just and the unjust, the wise and the foolish. There is one thing, though, that is reserved for the people of God, and that is wisdom. Let me give an example. This is how we know God gives things to those who are wise and unwise, the foolish and not foolish, and the just and unjust. Prime example is Chick-fil-A. Millions of people are able to receive chicken sandwiches every day from the heavens above, every day but Sunday. All right. But they don't have access to the inside wisdom of that company. Like God gives, the point that I'm making here is that good gifts, whether it be Chick-fil-A sandwiches or wealth or spouses or whatever it may be, any earthly thing you can think of, God gives it freely. But the thing, in the same way that everyone can freely go to Chick-fil-A, they cannot freely ask how Chick-fil-A is run. That is a family thing. God is saying that he gives wisdom generously and ungrudgingly to his children. There is material things you can get any other kind of way, but godly wisdom only comes from the Lord. And so when we're talking about doubt, I looked up this word here. Now I started trying to figure out, what does this mean? When he says, but let him ask in faith without doubting. I know that doubt is used in quite a few different ways throughout the Bible. I wanted to look, I'm not going to tell you what the Greek word was and all that. More so, I wanted to see how this word was used in different ways throughout the scriptures. And I was kind of surprised. This word doubting is oftentimes used in the context of making a judgment, which I thought was kind of odd. Like I thought the other passages would be about doubt, like doubting whether or not, Jesus is the Messiah or whatever it may be, and unbelief and stuff like that. But ironically, it kept being used in the context of judgment. It was making a judgment. How this word can be played out, and we're going to touch on this in just a moment, a little later. It's making a judgment or discerning between two things. It's holding two opposing and possibly equal options on a scale and then making a judgment. And so the irony that's happening here is saying that doubt is not simply the whole passage about a lot of things in James. The thing we see is really about making impartial judgments and making wise judgments. And yet we have here this allusion to making doubt, but let him ask in faith without doubting. The doubter is holding two things in opposition, but two possibly, in their mind at least, equal options on a scale, and then making a judgment. So what does this mean for us? We just went through all these passages, and I want to hopefully make some sense of this and how we can apply this. The scriptures say to consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials. Many people are asking for the trials to stop. We're looking for, well, I'm not saying that I want this pandemic to go on. I'm not saying that I want heart attacks to continue. I'm not saying that I'm expecting or hoping for things to get worse. But instead, we understand that really wisdom knows that trials never stop. Whether you pray for them to stop or not, trials never stop. Different versions of the trials may stop. At some point, this pandemic will end, whether that's in 6 weeks, 6 months, and whatever. There's totally different timelines out there, 18 months, a whole bunch of different things. But even when this thing ends, something else is going to happen. Trials never stop. And so rather than simply asking for the trials to stop, we must ask for wisdom in the trials to be able to discern what the trials are for. And this trial is for us to endure. So we count it joy. It is wisdom to count it as joy when various trials and temptations come your way. And so in this, if we lack the wisdom, see it this way, that's fine. We can ask God for wisdom. So if we lack it, God will give it to us. But oftentimes we don't ask for it. We don't come to God to pray in faith. And why is that? Even now, like, as I mentioned earlier, the way that I make money, the way I make my living, going on tour, doing shows and stuff like that. And the first thing that my knee-jerk reaction was when things got canceled was to simply say, okay, I got to figure out how to make up for this. I had just went under contract to get a house. I've never owned a home before, and I'm trying to get a home, and I've got to put down a down payment. And so I got a lot of money about to come out of my account, but not a lot about to come in. So I ain't no accountant, but I know basic math and subtraction. Things ain't adding up. So the first thing I thought was, I got to do something. I've got to figure out what I'm going to do. And so that example is a clear hint at how we're thinking when we don't come to God in prayer. If we lack wisdom, and God says, I'll give it freely, despite your earthly attributes, and we still don't pray for it, then what happens is we're trying to compensate for it with our earthly attributes. If we lack wisdom, despite earthly attributes, and God says he's going to give it to us, and you still decide not to pray, then what you're doing is trying to compensate it with your earthly attributes. And here's an example. The body, our physical human body, oftentimes overcompensates when something is not sufficient for a particular task. And this is oftentimes this is what leads to major athletic injuries. This happens when one particular part of the body is weak. And so, for instance, someone tears their ACL or whatever it may be, oftentimes, and that's why they do a lot of preventative workouts like that, everything is connected. And so the weight of you jumping up and down was really supposed to be mostly taken by, your hip muscles and your glutes and your hamstrings and so forth, right? But when those things are not sufficient, when they are weak, what happens is the body overcompensates. All of that weight now begins to be held by the bones and the joints instead. And that's how you get tendinitis. That's how you get ACL injuries, all that. What I'm trying to say is that there is a load that is a heavy load that's supposed to be carried by a particular strong part of the body. But because that is weak, other parts are now trying to overcompensate for it. And so there's a chain effect when someone tries to compensate for a weight that it was never meant to carry. And so what happens is when you don't ask for wisdom in times like this or any other trial and tribulation, when you don't ask for wisdom, one particular life is affected, but then another part tries to compensate for it, and then it trickles down. When our prayer life is weak, then our intellect tries to kick in. All right, and then like it's like, all right, let me figure this out. Or our financial, we try to finance our way out of something, or we try to use our resources, our relationships, or just flat out worrying. Whatever it is, we try to figure out everything on our own except pray. We do everything except pray, and so you have now other things in our life become disrupted and disgruntled and injured, because we're trying to overcompensate for it in a way that it was not supposed to be. And so that's why God calls us to pray, because these heavy loads are only to be carried by the one we bring those prayers to, which is God. And some of us do pray, but as we see in verse 6, it's still a warning. It says that they don't ask in faith. And so in a sense, we're still overcompensating. And as I'm trying to figure out what he meant by they should not expect anything from the Lord, as they're trying to hold out this judgment, I'll explain what I mean here. A great example is this, and I'm about to wrap up soon. A great example is this. I hate when some of my friends, or anybody for that matter, ask me for advice on a situation, and then without fail, they still reason themselves into their own conclusions. It's like, why you ask me, bro? They weren't asking for wisdom. What they was really trying to do was hear all the possible oppositions that they had to their conclusion that they were already set on, essentially. Basically, they just come to me to see all the things that I would say that would push back, and then they were going to come up with a reason against it. Should I buy these shoes? And I say, well, technically, you're broke. Okay, you haven't paid for rent. You don't have no money. No, you shouldn't get the shoe. But I really like them. Right. But your bank account doesn't. Your bank account don't like them. And I've literally had someone tell me, all right, well, I said if they don't have them in my size, then I won't get them. But they had them in my size, so I knew that was a sign that I was supposed to get them. And it's like, why did you ask me for wisdom? Why? Why are I even asking me? The friend had already had a set of inferior standards of making a judgment call. And then they were going to use that inferior standard to judge the advice that I was going to give them. And now they broke. First they were just broke. Now they just broke because they went and got the shoes. And that's what we do with God. We come to God. Doubting is this. It is holding up our own conclusions, our own worldly standards, our own worldly ways of seeing things, and then bringing it to God and say, all right, God, what you got to say about it? And then I'm going to weigh out the two. And then I have to all right, that's doubting, is holding up a worldly standard, worldly intellect, worldly resources, or whatever it may be, and then looking at God's wisdom and then saying, all right, okay, cool. All right, what you got to say, world? Okay, cool. And then going back, why should you expect anything good to come out of that situation from God? They should not expect to receive anything. You're asking God for, and God's like, how can you expect for a wise outcome of this situation when you're holding my ways up to the world's ways or to your own ways as if they're equal choices? What's happening is we become a judge. We take God out of his judgment, out of his seat of judge, and then place him in the seat of defendant and say, all right, God, defend your case to me. Why should I go your way? And God says, I'm in no way to be on nobody's stand, to be on nobody's defendant or plaintiff. I'm the judge. And so to doubt God is to take him out of the judge seat and place him as a defendant. When we're supposed to be seeing God as judge, receiving his righteous judgments, and then making judgments about circumstances, just as he said in earlier in the passage, he says, consider it a great joy, brothers and sisters. He said, he's basically saying, judge these times, judge these trials and tribulations as a time for joy. But instead of doing that, we're judging God and saying, all right, God, I feel like I should be worrying. I feel like I should be doing this with my resources. I'm going to do that. I want to figure these things out. I'm going to get my list of things I'm supposed to do. And then I'm going to come to you and see what you got to say later, rather than say, no. That's not faith. That's not faith. That's being a judge. Proverbs says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. To doubt God is to try to lean on God and lean on yourself as well. It is to become double-minded and unstable in all your ways. And so the problem is this, is that I can tell you all this, and I know it sounds super convicting and all that. And hopefully it's been some good points to challenge yourself on. But the reality is you've been doing it. I've been doing it. And we'll probably do it again in the future. And so I can give you all the things to do and how to handle times like this, to handle the trials and tribulations and to not doubt and all that. But the reality is, and we still do. We still, it puts you in this kind of position of like, well, I feel bad. I feel bad that I've been doing it, but I don't, what is the solution? Thankfully, we have a Redeemer who is not unable to sympathize with us or even to empathize with us. God tells us to count it all joy, and then he does it himself. He counts the cross as joy. In Hebrews 12, verse 12, it says this, talking about Jesus, it says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus saw death and judgment at the cross, and he said, man, that's going to be joy. I'm doing it for joy. I'm going to go, I consider the cross. I consider that trial. I consider that tribulation. I judge that as something that will bring joy. And he does that in our place. He endures for those of us who lack endurance. He is our endurance. The whole goal is to see that endurance becomes works out, faith produces endurance to the end. How do we get to the end? The scriptures say in Philippians, he says that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Christ. And so if you're wondering how faith right now was going to produce endurance to the end, at the end of the day, Jesus is going to do what Jesus said he is going to do. He's going to work that thing out in your life. He is going to work and work and work. Even when you have been exhausted and don't have the stamina, he's going to work it until the day of Christ. And for those of us who doubt and feel like we've been tossed in the surging sea and it's hard for us to come to pray in faith to God, I think of Thomas, who was very similar. His faith was in a surging sea and driven and tossed by the wind. And Jesus comes to Thomas in his moment of doubt. And the first thing he says to Thomas, he says, peace be with you. He says, peace be with you. And Thomas was on the boat with Jesus. Thomas was on the boat with Jesus when he spoke to the raging sea, and he told that sea, peace, be still. And I'm pretty sure that Thomas recognized the voice of Jesus when he said it to his own storm. And so even in the times that we're doubting in our raging sea, we have a Redeemer who speaks to those raging seas, who speaks to the storms of doubt that we may have, even when we're coming through and vacillating on whether or not we're going to follow God or follow our own will. Jesus did that in our place. He says he has the option of saying, Lord, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. I don't feel like going to the cross. My feelings are not that way. But Lord, I will choose your way to go to the cross. If it be your will, I'll do that. And he does that in our stead. And that is not only our motivation and our example, but that is the substitute, the one who stands in our place, so that even when we are not living in a way that shows outstanding faith and that we don't have endurance, Hebrews 4:15 says, for we do not have a Redeemer who is unable to sympathize with our temptation, our weaknesses, but one who in every aspect was tempted just as we are, yet without sin. So he is the one who allows us to draw with confidence to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy in our time of need. The reason that we are able to come to the one who gives us wisdom generously and ungrudgingly is only because we have been made heirs and co-heirs with the one who has endured the cross for us. I hope that is some encouragement to you as I try to burn through a very broad topic as we are pressed to pray in faith in these times. Let's pray, and then I'll ask the others to hop on board. Lord, thank you for this time to go through your word. Such a fire hydrant of things that we could sip from in your word, God. We are in desperate need of your wisdom in these days, God. We have a lot of information out there, a ton of information. Lord, we don't want to run wild. Your scriptures say in Proverbs that without revelation, the people run wild, but with divine instruction, those who follow your divine will and instruction, they are happy. Oh, they have joy, God. And so I ask that you will give us divine instruction in these times as we listen to all the information that's coming around, that you will give us divine instruction and peace and the wherewithal and the awareness and the wisdom in what to do in these times. Lord, we love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.